Welcome to the Dairy Farmers Digest, a podcast dedicated to all things dairy farming. Each episode, we will talk to industry leaders who share their insights and experiences into the dairy business. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to Dairy Farmers Digest. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer. Super excited today to have Dr. Gerard Cramer from the University of Minnesota on. Now, Gerard's a veterinarian and has a degree in veterinary science as well. Is there any other credentials behind your name these days, Gerard? Or
no, nothing added. So that's enough. My wife says I should stop going to school. So
you go to school every day, though, don't you?
Pretty much.
No, that's good. So I know we were just talking a little bit of what's going on in Minnesota this morning. You said it's relatively cold and lots of snow.
Yeah, it's relatively cold, and we got a lot of snow this month, so it's cold. Nothing like in Ontario, I guess, where you've had more rain and stuff, but we've had tons of snow.
Yeah, I always kind of joke, like, whatever happens in Minnesota, Wisconsin, we kind of get 2 days later. But it's been a horrible winter. I feel it's just been so dark and gray and kind of gross, rainy. Now we have some snow this morning. It's about, I don't know, -3 or 27 degrees Fahrenheit for American listeners. But it would be nice to get some cold, a nice little cold snap. It seems to get sunny when it gets cold. So
yes, it's going to be sunny here today, and I think for the next week it's going to be -20-ish.
Yeah, well, you guys can keep that. Like, we don't need that, but
the lakes might make it warmer. So
yeah, we got those blue blankets on either side of us. So yep. But so it's been a while since we had you on the podcast. I know you were one of the original kind of guests that we had on back when we started in 2020. So what's changed, I guess, in the hoof health academia world since you were on last time?
Oh yeah, so it's been a whirlwind. So I think everybody's COVID is flying by. Probably the latest thing I'm working on is something related to detection of lameness. So we're working with companies such as Cattle Eye, but there's other companies too that are basically using cameras to watch cows walk and then trying to assign them a locomotion score, and then using that to tell the farmer, do I treat this cow or not treat this cow, or can we use her to put her on trim list and those type of things.
That's interesting. So are they using the camera technology just to identify cows that don't have like good gait or
Yes.
Hunched up backs, or just general locomotion?
General locomotion. So basically what they do is the company I'm working with right now is called Cattle Eye, and they have a security camera that they basically mount above the return lane. They need about 12 feet that the cow walks underneath of it. And then basically it takes points on the cow's body and basically on how much they move or deviate from what they consider normal. Then it assigns the cow a score from 0 to 100. And then some of the data we have, it shows that it's not a perfect correlation. Like if it says cow's 50, she's not guaranteed to be lame, but we can identify cows that get lesions. Like if we look back and say, okay, well, this cow is going up. There are cows that have, like, for example, with hemorrhages or sole ulcers or foot rot. We can identify those cows with that technology.
So the accuracy, like, is that just going to get better with time? Like, is there's more data in the, like, more cows are looked at? So
yeah, more cows are looked at, and more people use it, because right now it's just like they've done the sensitivity and specificity, saying, okay, this is relatively decent, but then to turning into a tool and make useful decisions on the farm, that's kind of the next step. So as we figure that out, I think it'll become more prevalent and a good tool for people to think about putting in barns.
Yeah, it just seems like we're at the early stages in some of the stuff. Like, you're seeing more and more cameras and things in barns now, and I think mostly for security and employee safety. But
yeah,
I think we're going to see a lot more of these technologies adapting.
Yeah.
Now, is it kind of along the lines of like the body condition cameras that were kind of around a little bit, or?
Yeah, same idea. So this, I think I know of at least 3 different companies that are working on it, but they all use kind of some sort of camera. One of them, and most of them are working on body condition scoring and locomotion. But basically, they take the pictures and then they use artificial intelligence and machine learning to kind of feed the data set. So that kind of remembers what the cow was last time and kind of uses that history and other data to kind of say, okay, this is what the score is.
Yeah. Okay. That's super interesting. Like, it's it never ceases to amaze me how people are adapting different technologies on the farm to do diagnostics now. Like the amount of information that you can get from a robot or a parlor is just, I think, just the beginning. Like you said, with cameras, or there's going to be other things that we don't even know about yet
Exactly. And then
that
I think,
are going to be there.
and then the next thing is taking all that information and doing something together, right? Because that's where it's like integrating that, right? Because if a cow has the score, we can integrate some of the milk production data and other data, then you can say, okay, we get a lot more confident that there's actually a problem with this cow. That's the future, I think.
How long until like this is herd level? Like we talking like 3, 5 years or?
So it's being marketed now, but I would say it still needs a little bit of fine tuning to kind of come up with like an actionable item. But there are some early adopters that are working. Like I have 2 dairies that I work with, or 3 dairies that I work with that have it on. But we're still like, how do we use this tool? So on one dairy, we just use it to kind of put cows on the trim list. So we just trim everybody dry off, and then the rest of the cows basically get put on the trim list based on if they're above 50 or if they've had a history of being above 50. And we put them on the trim list as an example. But that's more to try and figure out, is it actually working? But in this scenario, it seems to be helping the dairy. Like we've reduced the number of trimmings that we're doing, yet still improving lameness.
This technology is just going to get better as time goes on, right?
Yes.
So
If you ask me in a year from now, I think, or 2 years from now, there'll be a lot more farms, and I can feel more confident saying this is what you need to do with this technology. Now I'm like, well, we need to learn more about the technology before I'm ready to say this is how much you're willing to pay for it, right? Because the company's charging something for it, and I'm not convinced I can say with 100% certainty you're going to get a return on that charge at this point. And that's where I'd like to get to, where we can say, yes, this is the price you're paying, and this is how much money you're going to make when you make that investment.
well, the interesting thing about some of these technologies is they don't have any bias. Like
Yeah.
you or I go into a herd, and like how I lameness score versus how you're going to lameness score is going to be very different. But that's like, this is our parameters that we have set.
Yes.
And if it deviates from that, then we'll have an alarm, or that cow's sound. So she just keeps looking.
Exactly. It's the same
We're
every
walking
day.
away. Yeah. Yeah. So from new technology, I kind of want to segue into old technology and kind of tried true stuff with foot bathing. I know in the last episode we talked about stuff, but I kind of want to dive a little bit deeper into the foot bath. And one of the things that people are doing is acidified copper sulfate or acidifying copper sulfate. Can we maybe just walk through that, just kind of a helicopter view of kind of the science behind that, and maybe some different products that we can use? I know just trying to source some ingredients like sodium bisulfate and things like that for producers. Let's jump off there.
Okay. So typically when we talk about acidifying, we're using copper sulfate. The reason for that is if we take, let's say, if you have a 50-gallon foot bath or a 2-liter foot bath and you put a half a bag of copper sulfate in it, about half of that actually goes in solution. The other half kind of lays on the bottom and isn't necessarily active. And that's because the pH isn't appropriate enough. So the way the science behind it is typically if you put it in there with water, you get to end up with a pH of about 5.5. If we decrease that pH by at least 1 pH point, so the 4.5, you're going to get 100% of that copper into solution. So that's the reason for acidifying, because then what you're putting in, let's say you're putting in 5%, you're really only getting 2.5%. Well, if you acidify it, then you're going to get all of the copper sulfate in action. So then you're going to get the 5%. But you probably don't need the 5%. So you can save money and go to the 2.5%, because that's what we've been using in the past already without knowing it. So that's the kind of the science behind it. You need to reduce the pH at least 1 score to get the effect, to get all of the copper in the solution. So basically you're trying to reduce the amount of copper that's in the foot bath, and then in turn, amount of copper that ends up on your field, because that's ultimately kind of what we're trying to do. And then there's different products out there that can do that. But the key is basically whatever acid you put in there, whether it's sodium bisulfate or there's many of the companies sell a commercial acidifier that are priced magically to end up with the same price if you were putting a full bag in. So buyer be aware, but that's typically what the pricing is. But the key is that you don't go too low with your pH, because if you go too low, we can actually create more chronic chronicity in the lesion. So you want to stay around a pH, not start your foot bath around a pH of 3. Some people have gone a little lower. That's somewhat product dependent, but it's safe to say 3, maybe 2, but probably 3 safer. and then you want to monitor it, and you want to change your foot bath or add more acid when it gets up to 4.5, because that's when you get above it. So more of the copper then gets out of solution, and then you don't have the same effect. So basically you reduce your copper sulfate to 2.5%. So if you're putting in, let's say, half a bag, you're going to put in a quarter of a bag plus an acid, monitor your pH, and then at the start, and then I kind of monitor it throughout the time. So, okay, my foot bath lasts, let's say 300 cows, and then I can change it because then it's at 4.5. So then I should probably change it. That scenario.
So you're looking at something, say, so just for easy math. So if we're doing a 100-liter foot bath, I'm not saying that's the right number, but I'm just saying, like, for easy math, you're looking at, you'd add, say, 2.5 kilos of copper sulfate, but then you want to make sure that pH is, between 3 or 4 at an on-farm level.
Yes, start out at 3, because the closer you get to 4, the shorter the foot bath's going to last. Right.
Yeah, because the manure just is basic, right?
Yeah. So you're just adding, as soon as the cow starts walking through, your pH is going to go up. So you want to start as low as possible. So I started around 3, and then go up from there.
Okay. Is there a magic number for amount of cows through a foot bath, or is it all just dependent? Like you say, test the pH, and if it starts getting high, then we've got to either redo the foot bath or add more product to make sure that pH stays down.
Exactly. To me, there's no magic. There is no magic in life. So it all depends, right? It's easy to say you need to change it every 200 cows, but that's, I would argue, is a farce, right? That works for some dairies. Other dairies can get, like, some dairies, we run 1,000 cows through a foot bath. So it all depends on the flow, the foot bath design, if the cows are used to it, if they're being pushed through, all those things kind of matter.
So it's just like everything else in life, there's a lot of nuance involved.
Yes, there is no black and white. There's a safe answer, 200 cows, sure, but
yeah, but you might be throwing, you never know. You're either going to be ineffective, or you might be throwing expensive product out. Because I know, like, some of these copper sulfates and things like that, they're not cheap to run a foot bath. Like, there's a cost associated with it. So
exactly.
And as margins get tighter, I know they're pretty good right now, but I know, like, there's a lot of costs that have gone up. Milk prices up, the costs have gone up. So I think anything that we can do to be a little bit tighter is good.
Yes.
What about order a foot bath? Like if you're going to do, say, your traditional, like, formaldehyde copper sulfate type foot bath, like, do you do copper first or formaldehyde first, or is there an order which you run, or do you go back and forth? Or in Gerard's perfect world, what do you see out there?
So in my perfect world, I would just stick to one product. I don't necessarily think it's important to switch one or the other products. So because of my Dutch origin, I like the cheapest product possible. So that's probably formalin. And I would argue we can use the product safely. So to me, I pick a product and then I just use that product as many times as I need to. So I'm a pretty data-oriented person. So I start out, like, if I don't know or don't trust the data, I start out a farmer, let's say 5 days a week with continuous use. So start Monday to Friday, they run copper sulfate or formalin. And then if we do that for 3 months and say, okay, are we happy with the level we have? If we are, and we want to try to save some money, or if we're risk averse, then we stay there. But if we're willing to say, okay, we're happy with this level, let's go to 4 days a week. And then we do that for 3 months. And if the levels stay the same, so if the trimming records show that we're not getting any new cases and the chronic cases aren't coming back on us, then we can go to 4 days. And then we just keep going that till we get to kind of the sweet spot where we're like, okay, if we know we go less than, for example, let's say we go to 3 days a week, things stay the same. But when we go to 2 days a week, we start to see more cases and we're not happy with that number of cases, then we stay at 3 days a week and we just go back. Mm-hmm. So to me, the order doesn't matter, because we're just trying to basically disinfect the foot. So we can use any disinfectant to do that. There's no other benefits. One of the myths I think that you hear is a copper sulfate hardens feet. And that's a myth. There's no biological way that we can get copper sulfate, a cow walking through a copper sulfate foot bath for 2 to 3 seconds. He's not going to absorb any copper in that hoof. That's got to harden the foot. And you'll hear lots of people say that.
Well, I was always, and thanks for busting this myth, but I was always under the impression, and I guess it's just not listening, or listening to people like you and not listening to just people in the industry, but the formaldehyde would essentially, I guess it maybe would inflame the foot a little bit, and then the copper would do the opposite reaction and tighten that foot bath foot back up a little bit, make it a little bit harder. But obviously, I was wrong.
I would say yes. So for other reasons, we've been trying to dig into this a little bit. So there's one small paper that suggests that the copper hardens the foot in one particular location of the foot. But if we think about like how foot gets harder, right? How the foot gets hard, the biggest factor is how wet it is, right? The other factor is kind of the trace minerals that we feed. And the way the foot is basically built, it starts inside the foot. And basically what happens is, let's say you have all these trace minerals and all these stuff floating around, some things like copper sulfate, zinc, probably more importantly, calcium, amino acids, and sulfur containing amino acids and biotin. They are in the blood supply, and then they go to the cells that grow the horn. And those cells are kind of right underneath the blood supply. And then those cells grow something called keratinocytes, so basically skin cells. Mm-hmm. Those skin cells grow, and in the horn, there's like different layers of them. So there's alive skin cells, and then eventually they become dead skin cells. And all those nutrients basically have a role to play to create this strong bonds. So those cells kind of stick together and are hard, strong cells. And eventually those cells die, and they kind of, all the contents of that cell get squished out, and they create kind of the glue and basically the tight junctions to hold things together. But they also create kind of a fatty layer that keeps the outside world out. So that's kind of like, we call it a lipophilic layer. So basically a fat membrane in the horn that keeps basically the moisture from going into and damaging the tissues that are actually alive and growing. So that's why copper sulfate or any chemical would be very hard to get into the cells that actually make the copper, like the skin cells. They might tinge stuff blue, but that's because there's like, we're dealing with dead tissue, right? So the same as you stick your finger in something, it's not like you're absorbing, it's absorbing some of it, but it's not getting to the cells that are actually making it. And that's what we require to make it hard.
Well, and the skin is your barrier to prevent things like that, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that makes a lot more sense than what I was saying. So
yes, right. But and that's some of these things, some of these myths. Like if we start going back to basic principles and saying, okay, how are these cells grown, and how does this happen? Then it's some of those things that we believe. And people used to say that all the time. I'm like, yeah, maybe, I don't know, I don't think so, but sure. But if we start thinking about it logically and start digging into it, there's really not much evidence for it. The one thing that can happen is, let's say formalin or copper, if we get, it can make this, there's some data to suggest that it actually makes the hoof brittle, like it makes it softer, or like more likely to break, because it's denaturing some of those tight junctions that are there. But that's only at the very bottom layer, so far away from where the cells are actually growing and everything. So for a foot bath perspective, all you're trying to do is disinfect the foot. Don't worry about hardening the foot. Talk to your nutritionist and get the right nutrients in your ration to get hard feet and make sure your feet are dry. That's probably a way bigger impact than trying to run some copper just to harden the foot. That's a myth, I think, that we just need to get away from.
I want to touch on that nutrition thing, but I had one more question about like the foot bath and kind of like some of your DDs and things like that. Is there a time of year that is more susceptible to having issues like DD? Like, do you see it more in the winter, fall months, or the summer? Like I know a lot of these things are driven by the amount of moisture in the barn, and like you said, with how wet that hoof gets. Like, is there a difference with time of year, or is it just like if it's there, it's there, or does heat stress or things like that make a cow more susceptible to something like DD?
So yes, it does, and it totally depends on the dairy, right? So I was looking at some data from a big system in November, and we were starting to see more DD in the spring, which kind of didn't necessarily make sense. But then when we thought about it, because of the cold winter that we have here in Minnesota, sometimes you don't run the foot bath as frequently in the wintertime, right? So then we're kind of allowing things to kind of get out of control, and then we kind of see a spike later on. So that's one example where, because it's cold, we don't run the foot bath as much, things are frozen. So then we get more with it. Another scenario would be if you have soakers in your barn. Now your floor is a little wetter in the summertime, right? So you might get more DD late summer, early fall, because cows are standing in more wet. There's more exposure to everything else. So there's definitely a pattern, but it totally depends on the dairy. And I would argue, if we know what that pattern is on your farm, we can say, okay, we know we get more DD in the spring, for example. So we're actually going to foot bath more in the winter when we can. Right. So instead of, if we're doing 3 days a week normally and we're safe with that level, in the winter we might go to 4 days a week because we know there might be a week where we can't do anything. So we want to stay ahead of it as much as we can. So when we have to take that break because it's a skating rink, we're not going to create as much of a problem. Whereas if we're at a lower level of foot bathing.
And with your foot baths, are we going to run a treatment rate versus a prevention rate? Like, is there such a thing, or do you just want to run a consistent rate all the time?
I want to run a consistent rate all the time, and we can probably run lower than what we're used to. So with formalin, I've run as low as 1%, but between 1% and 3% is probably a safe level. So we can actually, as we've learned more, we can actually create more chronicity, so more chronic lesions. Let's say we have a cow that has got a DD, for some reason, or a heifer that came in with DD into a herd. If we run too strong of a foot bath, we can actually create more kind of skin proliferation, and that just creates more of a reservoir. So if we kind of moderate how much foot bath chemical we use, so let's say 2.5% copper and 1 to 3% formalin, we actually reduce the number of chronics that we have, and we can have a more steady state of disease instead of having some of these nasty lesions and then some healthy lesions. So to me, it's all about prevention, because treatment, to me, the fastest way to make the cow feel better is to run her through a chute and put topical treatment on her in that case, because we're dealing with a much higher concentration. But as far as treatment rates, not saying we can't use a foot bath. Like if you have a problem, running a foot bath is the fastest and easiest way to get things under control. But I still run the same level as I would for prevention.
Well, I always talk about the same kind of mantra, is that prevention is way cheaper than treatment. So let's do as much prevention as we can and try and mitigate treatments. Yes. Just because it does take so much time and energy. Like if you got to separate cows out and run them into a hoof trim chute, like there's probably more areas where you're going to stress that cow out and cause more harm than good.
Yes.
Well, you're going to help her out a lot, but I think that it's like you're ripping the Band-Aid off before, like you're going to cause a bit of harm and stress to that cow before she gets better.
Yeah, completely agree. To me, warts or digital dermatitis is the easiest of the foot lesions to control. We know exactly what we need to do. And basically your foot bath's the dial. If you're not happy with it,
crank it up.
That dial, crank it up.
Yep.
Crank it up with frequency. Don't crank it up with concentration, but crank it up with frequency. And like we have dairies that were less than 1%. If they run it religiously, we can get really low levels.
I think they call that more better.
Yes.
You do it more, it's better,
Yes.
But so to go back to the nutrition thing, like what can producers or nutritionists do to kind of help with that? I know we've talked about trace minerals, whether it be copper, zinc, cobalt, B vitamins, biotin, that kind of stuff. Like, what's the best bang for the buck?
What's the best bang? That's a great.
Because they all have a cost associated, right? So
yes, to me, I think we can't expect them to be silver bullets, right? To me, they're kind of like the icing on the top. And what's the best bang for the buck? I'm struggling because there's no good answer. If I was just kind of generalizing, I would probably, biotin seems to be, if we feed biotin, so let's go take one step back. All these products takes time to have an effect. So from the data we know, biotin takes about 6 months. So if you're not going to feed it in your dry period, you're losing some impact, right? Because you can't just start and stop it, because that horn is being grown every single day. So if you don't feed it for 2 months, are we really going to get the benefit? What probably is the risk period in the transition period. So, and same thing goes for those trace minerals. So we need to consider when we feed them. And then the bang for the buck probably would be, so to me, biotin, there's actually looks like some data even for a milk effect, separate from a hoof health effect. That seems to be somewhat consistent. And then for the trace minerals, probably copper and zinc would be the main one to focus on.
Well, I wonder with the biotin, is it a chicken or an egg? Like what came first? Did you put the biotin in and then all of a sudden you got more milk? But is that because cows are more sound on their feet, like they're having less hoof issues, right?
Yeah, in theory they should. So, and like biotin, like those B vitamins have so many impact on the cow too. And same with zinc, right? Zinc is I think I was at a nutrition conference last week. There's 400 enzymes in the cow's body that depend on zinc. So we can feed it
Yeah.
for the foot, right? But that might be, let's say 20, maybe 10 to 20 enzymes that depend on it. But there's another 380 that the cow depends on, right? So think of the
Yeah.
holistic system. Like, yes, I like the feed, but it's still other things that are happening on the dairy too that we need to consider. To me, the key still is we need to feed it in the right time periods, right? So if we're expecting things to do and we're only feeding it for a portion of the period, we're not going to get the same value as you would if you fed it for a longer time period.
Yeah. Then what about like protected sort like B vitamins specifically, like protected B vitamins versus like a fat, like rumen protected versus, a free biotin? Like, do you double up the biotin or do you go with a protected source? Like, because like, honestly, like we don't know how it's going to react in cow. Like some cows have great response to just biotin, other cows don't. So like, what's the limiting factor there? Like, is it better off we just, we use a protected product that has biotin as one of its ingredients, and then, like, is that the right solution? I guess.
Yeah, and so honestly, I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows, right? That's where, once again, like I think we need some data to back some of those things up. But I don't. I'd have to look and go back at the research if they use the rumen protected biotin and that stuff or not. But I don't know. I would like logically, like you said, it makes sense to make it rumen protected, but maybe you get an impact because now the rumen bugs take up some of those vitamin B and we get better energy and protein production by the rumen bug. So I don't know is the answer I have, but somebody smarter than me in nutrition might have a better answer.
sounds like we need a B vitamin expert to come on.
Yes. Fair enough.
I want to bust some more myths because the first one with the foot bath was really good. Is there a link between nutrition and, say, hemorrhages or soul ulcers?
I typically say no, not as much as we think. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
Historically, so I'm hedging my bets, and I'll get to why I'm hedging my bet. So historically, nutritionists got blamed, or nutrition got blamed for, like, basically we give the cow rumen acidosis, she gets what we typically call laminitis, and then things blow up, and that's why she's lame. That was easy to say, okay, it's a nutritionist's fault because she gave the cow acidosis, forgetting the fact that many different things cause acidosis. There's actually more data if you look at the whole picture that it's more likely a transition cow disease. So what's happening in the cow during transition typically result in inflammation. That's actually more responsible for causing soul ulcers and hemorrhages than straight ruminal acidosis equals soul ulcers and soul hemorrhages. The reason I'm hesitating is, so I've just completed, and I think the paper's coming out this year, where we've tried to give cows soul ulcers, right? Because it's kind of the holy grail. If we actually look, that's the holy grail. It's something I consider a holy grail. It's a dream I have. Because if we know how to create it and can reproduce it, it's much easier to do some of these studies that you're asking. We can say, well, does biotin affect the number of soul ulcers we get? Well, if I can create them on command, basically, or on demand, then we can answer that question much easier than if I need to feed it to 2,000 cows and look at those 2,000 cows' feet every 6 months and everything else, right? So that's the reason I think we can answer some important questions a lot faster if we can actually induce soul ulcers in these cows. I've tried to do that, and I've been, I would say, unsuccessful to create soul ulcers. We can create soul hemorrhages. But what I did to do that, typically, so if we think about separate from nutrition, just the new thinking is either it's an inflammatory process and in combination with standing time. So cows are just standing too much. And interestingly, if you look in the literature, when cows get ruminosidosis, one of the responses is they stand more. Right. Yeah. And if we think about why some cows get ruminosidosis or subclinical or subacute ruminosidosis, one of them is problems with feed delivery, right? So if the cows are waiting, they're standing more, waiting for the feed to come, empty bump syndrome, then they may be slug feed. So it's a combination.
Well, even simple things like heat stress or cow comfort, like, is it a chicken or the egg? Is that cow standing more and gets acidosis, or is that because she can't ruminate or she's not ruminating as much? Yeah. Or is it something happening management factor wise in the barn? You're talking about, sorting or slug feeding, or, it's just generally hot in the barn and that cow can't lay down. Like, what came first, the chicken or the egg?
Right. And that's what we're trying to figure out. Right. So yeah, we're pretty like if we have a herd with a soul ulcer or soul hemorrhage, like typically a soul ulcer problem, if we fix the standing time issues, things get better. But when I did the study, like I at some point gave cows or took 6 hours or restricted them that they only had 6 hours where they actually could lay down if they had the opportunity, but that included milking and everything else. So I took 18 hours, I made them stand up twice in like 9-hour bouts, and I forced them to stand up for that time period. That's a lot of time standing for a cow. And if you do that too, it was kind of amazing because we have all seen cows lay down in alleys and everything else that they don't actually start doing that until you really, really, really restricted your lying time away from them. So if I see cows laying down in alleys now, I know we've probably taken like, these cows are forced to stand for 18 hours or more before they actually start doing that. So, and when I did that, so the thing what I did is I put a block on the foot and made them stand for extended time periods. And the other thing we did, we gave them an inflammatory event. So we tried to restrict their feed intake, and then we gave them basically we injected E. coli into their veins to kind of give them a challenge that makes them use a lot of energy or glucose, and kind of create this inflammatory event. Even with all those things, so the worst thing I did was during the dry period we restricted feed intake to 70%. So the next day they went dairy with slug feed. During that same time, and they also would get basically ketosis or subclinical ketosis. Then what we did is we made them stand for at least 3 hours continuously. So we took 6 hours of lying time that we forced them to stand. And then another subgroup of cows, we gave them this E. coli injection, basically, or this endotoxin injection to kind of create this inflammatory event, all during the transition period. So within the first week, we gave them these injections. So these cows had ketosis or should have had ketosis, were forced to stand, had just gone through calving. So all the ligaments are loose. So the bone inside the hoof should be able to sink. And even doing that, I still couldn't give him soul ulcers. And they had a block on that was horribly placed to force them to be lame. They all were lame. I can make them walk severely lame. And when I look at them with an infrared camera, we could see signs of inflammation in the foot, but not enough to actually basically kill the cells that grow the horn to create the soul ulcer. So there's more going on, or we don't know. Maybe my challenge wasn't severe enough or long enough to do it, but that's why I'm hedging my bet. I used to be like, it's not nutrition. And I'm like, well, it's not 100% standing time. It's not 100% inflammation. So there must be something else going on.
Like death by 1,000 cuts. Like it's just compacting factors that cause these issues, right?
Yes, right. That's why I think if we take the standing time away, it's kind of like a scale, right? So the cows walk in this fine line. And if we put too much standing time on there, we create it. But if if we have those other things, not like if the scale's up here, like it's unbalanced towards like we're not getting it, we add the standing time, nothing might happen. So it's many factors that go into it. It's not simple. Oh, too much standing time or too much starch or too much this creates the soul ulcers.
Well, and I guess the question is it nutrition or is it nutrition related factors like delivery, form of the TMR, formulation of the diet? Like there's a lot of different factors that are involved. Like, is it, completely hygienic silage, or is there mold challenges in it, right? Or do you have vomitoxin issues? There's just a plethora of factors that could affect it. So to nail it down and say, oh, it's one thing or another, I don't know. Like you're telling me, like you've tried a lot of different things. Yeah, and still couldn't do it. So
no, right. And then we'd argue pretty severe things. Like I actually stopped part of the experiment because the cows were they were starting to lay down in the holding area, like this one they were brought up because that's the only time they had to lay down. So and they started the cows there's a shiny coat and then there's like a dull gray coat where they look really bad. Those within 2 or 3 days of that 18-hour lying time or standing time, they look like that, where you're like, oh my goodness, what am I doing to these cows? And still, they didn't get soul ulcers.
They're so resilient. I think they're a lot more resilient than we give them credit for.
Yes, which is also the flip side of that is that when they do get soul ulcers, they're amazing because they can deal with it. But when we've broken that resiliency at some point, right? So,
like you mentioned a lot about transition, and a lot of the study was kind of focused around transition. So what is it about that period of time that relates to foot health through the whole lactation. Like, I know it's a dirty word sometimes around the dairy industry. Like, anytime you seem like you have issues with animals, whether it be calves, cows, usually the word transition is involved in the sentence somehow.
Yes.
Uh, um, like, is it just so many different physiological things are happening in that cow? Like, you can compound some of those detrimental factors, I guess.
Yes. And then specifically with lameness, I think the chronicity also plays a role. But probably what we think the driving factor in all those things is likely inflammation, and which is basically a catch-all phrase. But because when a cow calves, there's some inflammatory events that need to happen. Like we need some sort of inflammation to clean the uterus, right? It's when that inflammation kind of goes haywire, that's when the problems start to happen. And there's a whole bunch of hormones that are released, and we have negative energy balance on top of that, which some cows can handle and some cows can't handle, right? So all those things kind of put together. But for lameness, we think it's probably an inflammatory event that's causing it. So there's inflammatory mediators kind of floating around because the cow is this calf. And those inflammatory mediators act on the tissues around the bone. And typically what happens when inflammatory things are happening around the bone starts to grow more bone. And because the tissue that grows the horn, the corium, is very thin and right next to the bone, even if that tissue has some inflammation, because the cow's, for example, standing too much, that induces changes inside that bone. Basically, they get kind of a bone spur on it, and that bone spur persists. So she might get that in first lactation, and see cows again next lactation, has a small bit of inflammation again, but grows a little bigger bone spur, right? And imagine walking around with a rock every time you take a step. Now there's a little piece of rock sticking on it. So eventually that's going to create enough damage to create a sole hemorrhage or a sole ulcer. But in the transition, it's probably a combination of that, all those changes that are happening, plus the inflammation that results because of it. Plus, in some cows, the negative energy balance that it's pretty clear with some collaborator work that we're doing with somebody else that some cows can handle and they actually do well with subclinical ketosis. Other cows kind of fall apart when they have it. And if being able to figure out which cows handle it and which cows don't.
Yeah, we're hearing a lot more of that word resiliency around the dairy industry now. Like, what makes a cow resilient versus what makes her unresilient or not resilient? I don't know.
What makes her weak?
Yeah, what makes her weak? Yeah. Is there anything like special? Like, I know we talked about the biotin and stuff like that. Like, if you're feeding a close-up cow, like, is it long enough to be on a product like that or something, like, to get a benefit, or is it just too soon to tell? Or do you see the benefits? Transition isn't just the week around calving or week before, week after. It's like, it's considered, 60 days or something like that, 30 days before, 30 days after. Like, what can we do to prevent issues management wise or nutritionally, I guess, to kind of help mitigate that?
Yeah, so to me, it's like that 60-day window. Some people call it 90 days, whatever, right? It's the 30 days before and then whatever time period after, let's say 30 days after. So I know the cow signals people say is stress-free calving. I think that's a good way to kind of look at it, right? Whatever we can do to make that stress-free, that's going to help. And then nutritionally, it doesn't make sense to put all the magical solutions in it, right? But some herds, they might need some and some herds might need others. But I think that's where we can say, okay, in this herd, we know we're limited because we have some stressors in the transition period. So maybe we need to feed some rumen protected choline, for example, right? Because we're trying to do some things there. Other herds, maybe because of the stage of growth that they're in, they're not overcrowded and they probably don't need that product. So I think that's where it becomes you as a nutritionist or your farm can look at it and say, okay, what are my factors that I'm compromising some of that stress feed and other nutritional factors we can use to kind of overcome some of those things or complement or give the cow the best chance to do that type of thing, right? But for me to say every dairy should use biotin, trace minerals, rumen protected choline, this much rumensin. Well, rumensin is probably clear. Everybody should probably be feeding that. But I think that's not a wise use of resources that we have.
And I always kind of go back to is every time, like, if you kind of did a meta-analysis on the herds that have good transition success versus the ones that don't have good transition success, I think it goes back to one to two things. One is space. dry cow space, calving space.
Yeah.
These herds that, maybe overbuilt some of their transition areas, when they move into them, their problems go away.
Yes.
There's space
Definitely.
to be cows, there's space at the feed bunk. Like, it might seem overkill at the time, but I've done enough work with farms where if you take their amount of animals freshening and dairy comp and then underlay their transition diseases, 9 times out of 10, they're going to follow each other like
Yes.
perfectly across the screen or
Yes.
across the graph or however you're going to look at it. So,
yeah, no, I think that space is kind of the safety valve, right? So the more space you have, there's probably more errors that are permissible because the cow has the room to recover and she can go to another
yeah,
part of the bunk and get the feed that she needs and everything else, right? So
I know it seems a little bit weird. You said it's like 20 degrees where you are right now, but what about heat stress? Like, I think this is the best time of year to talk about heat stress, to be honest,
exactly.
because we have time to do something about it. Where, in the summer, it's already happening, or in the spring, it's already happened. Now we're just playing defense against it. So, a good hockey term, like, how do we get on the offense this time of year to prevent some of these lameness issues? Because I think a lot of it is around cow comfort. And the biggest influence on cow comfort in the summer, I believe, is temperature and humidity, right? So,
Yeah, and because the cow's response to all that is to stand up, like to stand underneath that tree. And so that's ultimately what we can do. So, and I think like hoof trimmers have a term and they call it block season, which is like late August, September, corn silage season, right? It's block season. So and that's because of the heat stress that's happening. So the things we can do, like anything you can do to keep your cows cool, is gonna pay off in less lameness and more milk, right? So like there's a whole range, like soakers, fans, and the key with some of these things is to do them longer than we think, right? So because cows experience heat stress around 18 degrees Celsius when they start changing behavior. So if you're running your fans during the day when it's extremely hot, the cow builds up that heat. So we need to keep running the fans even past when it's cooler so they can actually, their core body temperature gets down. Because otherwise it accumulates, right? We've all probably seen it where one day of hot temperatures isn't bad. But if we have a week of a hot spell, then really start to notice like milk production decreasing. That's just because the core body temperature just slowly keeps rising throughout the night, and then she's not as cool when the next heat wave comes. So we need to cool these cows probably longer than you think. But
well, I wonder about that too, because you see it a lot in July and August, especially, well, maybe even June too. But you get those stretches where it doesn't drop below 20 degrees or 70 degrees, I guess, Fahrenheit at night in the summer. Like, that's when it really starts to hurt. And then you see it later on in the season. And I'm going to use the word resiliency again. The cows have lost their resiliency to kind of combat that heat stress. So every heat event after that, you see a little bit more drop and a little bit more drop and a little bit more drop. So it's kind of a compounding effect, in my opinion. So is there something different that, say, a producer in California would do compared to a producer in, say, Ontario or Minnesota, where we do have a lot more humidity, where maybe in some of those temperate climates they have a lot more arid heat, I guess, drier
so
heat.
The dry heat, right? Which, and I've worked in California in June and July, and yes, you sweat a lot, but it dries off you really fast. So it's as long as you drink enough, it's actually surprisingly that it's not as bad as I thought it would be. Whereas in Minnesota or Ontario, it just feels like you feel gross.
I learned too, like, I went to California and I was looking at some of these barns, and there wasn't as much effort, I guess, put on heat abatement as I thought there'd be. But then I went to the Southeast US in Georgia and Florida. And if you want to learn about how to prevent heat stress, that's where for Ontario or anywhere that's got humidity, that's where you go, because, they're 35 degrees and 100% humidity, 100 degrees and 100% humidity. Like, it's terrible there.
Like in some of those, like, yes, they do stuff in California, but the biggest thing they probably do is get them out of the sun.
Yeah, shade. Get them in the shade.
Get them in the shade. A big difference. Exactly. And we can't, like, with our humidity, that doesn't help.
No, right? So we need air movement.
Yeah, we need air movement, and we need wet cows for a short time period so they dry. Like, kind of evaporative cooling we need. So that's like anything you can use evaporative cooling. So even like soakers, coming out of the parlor, for example, like, is that strategic? Because every cow walks through, right? So
Mhm.
now they're
Or in
cool.
the holding area.
Yeah, exactly. That's like a
Yeah.
barbecue.
Like in your perfect barn design setup, like where would you kind of focus your heat abatement strategy towards?
Definitely holding area, because that's like we're putting cows basically in an oven for, let's say, an hour. So they need to not, because it's like you talked about the cumulative effect, right? So if we put
Mhm.
them all in there twice or three times a day, you're gonna give them that bump in the core body temperature. So anything we can do to cool there, like soakers, fans, there should be fans definitely in every holding area, I would argue, in Ontario, and even soakers just to get them wet there. If we can be strategic with the water use there, we don't need to use as much out in the barn. Um, and then probably the other thing I would focus on is my close-up cows,
Mhm.
right? Because if we can control that, we're going to get better transition, less stress free, and then have as much air movement in the barn as we can with plus or minus the water. I used to be big on the water, but realizing we're adding water to everywhere. In some areas, water is a resource, probably not as much in Ontario because you have those blue blankets that we talked about.
Yep.
Some of the areas I work with, even in Minnesota, we get pretty dry at times. So we don't have to, but so water, I think we have to become probably a bit more strategic in some areas. How we strategically use the water?
Well, it's funny you say that because I was at a herd in Mexico and they did a lot of just their own research. And so what they were doing was looking at milk production versus cows going to the parlor 3 times a day with soakers in the pen versus moving the cows into the holding area, soaking them there, moving them back
Right.
in between every milking. So they're milking 3 times a day, and then in between milkings, they would move them up there. They actually seen more milk by moving the cows more and putting them up into the holding area, getting them soaked and getting them back to the pen than they did with the water on the feed rail.
Right.
Now that's just one farm, so I don't know. Like it's not been replicated that I know of.
But I think that's what they do in Israel too. Like that's not the first time I've
Okay.
heard of that,
Yeah.
right? So
Okay.
the
Yeah.
cooling pens. So and it seems counterintuitive, right? Because we're disrupting every single cow, putting them all in a pen.
But they don't like it. So I learned this about chicken barns too. Like they accumulate heat as they lay. So with the chicken barn, they put little sprinklers on. The chicken will stand up, and then the ventilation is allowed to dissipate the
Yep.
heat. So I
Yep.
wonder if there wasn't a bit of an effect like that with the cows, like the cow laying on
Sure.
the sand or on a compost pack. Like she's just going to
Yep.
put a lot of heat down below her, and then getting her up and moving actually helps her get some of that helps that evaporative effect, right? Because there's more
Yep.
surface area for wind to hit. So
Yeah, that makes sense.
but and then kind of the last question I have for you is kind of around barn startups. So I know there's been a lot of myths about concrete and how it can affect cow hoof quality and health. Like what like I think a lot of it goes to like the concrete being pretty basic, but I know in our last time I had you on, we talked about, the grooving and ridges and things like that. Like
Yep.
what's the most important, I guess, kind of consideration when a producer is moving to a new facility?
Yeah. So now I've looked into this. It was a while since I looked into it. So the one thing I don't remember the exact time frame, right? So one of them, if you can, and I know I've built a barn, so I know it doesn't always work perfectly, but if you give the concrete a chance to cure, right? I think it's 60 or 90 days. If you give them the chance to cure, that's going to help as far as the basic aspect of it. But probably the bigger thing is, like we talked about, the grooving or how abrasive the concrete is on move-in day, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because if it's new concrete and there's little edges because the scraper hasn't gone over it, that's probably as important because that's where we see typically the thin soles, and that's because the cows are walking on pretty abrasive concrete. So either grooving isn't done before, or we have a broom finish that's too abrasive, and now we have a cheese grater effect. So the cow walks on it, and it's new concrete, right? A new barn, the cow starts running, and then all of a
Yeah.
sudden they stop, and then you can see the skid marks on the floor, and the skid marks is horn. You see white marks on your new concrete, that's coming from somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything like producers can do? Like I know we talked to like I've seen them like run concrete blocks over, run the scrapers. I know some producers have put either treatments on the floors, whether it be like linseed oil or diesel fuel
Yep.
or even just liquid manure, just to kind of temper that a little bit. Like, are those
So
worth doing, or?
So if I would probably lean towards doing them if I like poured my concrete last month and now I have to move in, or like a couple of weeks
Yeah.
ago and now I have to move in, then I'd consider some of those treatments. Mainly because we don't really know if they work or not, but it seems like a safe thing to do. There's really no data behind either one, but I'd rather err on the side of caution from that aspect. And then as far as the cinder blocks or like running the scrapers or doing something, that's to get rid of the edges, right? So if you walk in your bare feet or run your hand along the concrete, and if you're feeling edges and your hand is like, this is kind of sore,
Mhm.
then I would probably start considering some of those things. So to me, I know it's easy for me to say, but if you have to have a very good relationship when the people are pouring your concrete, right? That's probably the most important day, because that's a lifelong impact. Or you're going to be spending extra money afterwards if they screw that up. So
Yeah.
if we can get that, like, I would almost prefer a perfectly smooth surface and cut in the grooves after, because that's the safest, right? Yes, you can roll in the grooves or like pull in the grooves, but that takes a very skilled person to do that appropriately, because the concrete needs to be set at the right time. And if you do it a little bit too late or a little bit too early, then you get those ridges, and then you need to get the cinder blocks out or the skid steer bucket, get rid of those edges.
And what about grooving? Like, say you get your floor poured earlier, but then they come back later and groove it, and then it's not long before cows go into their new home. Is there a big influence on that, or like does it make it more basic again? No,
it shouldn't, because the concrete's cured at that stage. Yes, you're digging a little deeper, but they're not going to touch the deeper part, right? And typically there's those diamond saws need a lot of water, so all that stuff is being washed away and everything else at that point. So I'm not.
There's always a gray film on everything after they're done, like all that pulverized concrete, right?
Yes.
Doesn't harden again, but it, like, you could tell it's like a clay or mud, almost there.
Yeah, so. Right. And you probably want to get rid of that, because that probably isn't the greatest. But as a kid, I remember sticking my hand and making concrete, and your hands don't feel too good afterwards, right?
No, they get dried out pretty quick.
Yes.
That's pretty basic stuff, right? So
yes,
as the opposite side of acidic, right? So it does the same thing. Like, you raise that pH, it gets pretty nasty too.
Yeah, so. Right. And we don't want that on the cow skin, right? Because we can damage the skin there.
Well, I appreciate your time coming on the podcast today, Gerard. Is there anything else that you kind of wanted to touch on, or any kind of smoking guns for the producers?
No, I think you hit on a couple of myths that we talked about, which was good. So
yeah, I might have to name this podcast the Mythbuster, but
we need some of that, right? That's
Keith was wrong a lot.
You're not the only one, right? And
no, and
I've said that are myths too, and I don't know it yet. So
yeah, well, the thing is, like, the more we learn, the more we don't know. We realize we don't know. So
yes,
it's always good to kind of put some science and some experience behind the numbers and see, what are some of these practical applications that producers can use, right? So
yes.
Anyways, Gerard, I truly appreciate it. I imagine you got to get to class here soon. So
no, I appreciate the invite. It was fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. This episode of the Dairy Farmers Digest is brought to you by the dairy team at Wallenstein Feed and Supply Limited. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe and follow us on your favorite podcast player, and please leave us a review. If you would like further information about today's topic, check out the show notes for further details and our contact information. I would also like to extend a special thanks to Christine Schoonerwood, our producer, and our sound engineer, Daniel Noguera.